Today we are talking with Dr. Nancy K. Bristow, the author of The American Pandemic, The Lost Wars of the 1980 Influenza Epidemic. Welcome to Redera.
Thank you for having me.
Fascinating book, and the book has been highly acclaimed as well, with primarily praised for his vivid writing and thorough research and his compelling narrative, especially in the times that we are in now. The book has far more relevance, and I wish more people will read about it. The American Pandemic book, how did it came about? Especially it has a personal meaning to you as well. Give us a little bit of background how the book came about and why did you decide to focus on this?
Well, it was a bit of a coincidence. I was a young faculty member. I was finishing my first book, which had connections to issues of the history of medicine. And on a trip with my father backpacking, I was just chatting away about family, this and that. And he said something about my great-grandparents dying in the flu pandemic. I was startled. I had no idea. I knew that my grandfather had been orphaned as a child, but I didn't know how. I didn't know the details of it. I'd never spoken with him about it. And I'd long been someone who was interested in this sort of little-known pandemic that had been such a massive event in world history. So I just jumped right in. Interestingly, once I began to research it, I discovered that the way the family remembered what had taken place was slightly incorrect. They had not died, in fact, in October, November, in the midst of the worst of the pandemic, but had died in what I think of as almost one of the aftershocks of the pandemic. They died in February of 1920. You can imagine my surprise in discovering them in the census for 1920 when they were who have died in 1918. But that actually helped me understand the ways in which pandemics persist even when the worst of them are over.
Exactly. There are always differences between what we are told and what the facts are, and that also plays out in a larger scale at the public level as well. To set the stage for you, at the time in the 1919, the flu had started emerging. The American people were 1918, I'm sorry, 1918, which lasted all the way till 1920. The people were already aware of the flu and influenza and how devastating they can be. There was also already a one that was 30 years ago that had swept through the nation. Give us the context of how people were, in what mental stage they were, how they were taking this outbreak, and then what happened.
So in 1890, there had been a global pandemic of influenza as well. So when we arrive in 1918, Americans both knew that influenza could come in this sort of pandemic form, but they had also kind of domesticated influenza in the same way I think we have today. People were shocked to learn that influenza kills 35,000 Americans every year in 2020. There was a similar attitude about it in 1918. Influenza was just that yearly visitor that we all hate, but you usually survive it and it goes away and we go on with our lives. In the spring of 1918, as a result, when the first wave of this new pandemic arrives, perhaps originating in Kansas in the United States, Americans didn't take note. The only sort of recognition that something was happening was among medical epidemiologists because of some concentrations in military camps and some strangeness to what was happening, that they were losing soldiers to influenza. Many young people seemed to be dying of it, was of note. And also that in their postmortem, in their autopsies, there were some strange discoveries of kind of soggy lungs and signs of hemorrhaging in the lungs that put some doctors on edge about what was happening. But there were no articles published in the Journal of the American Medical Association about that spring pandemic, not one. But the world started to take notice when American troops traveling to the Western Front, where of course World War I is taking place, they carry with them this flu virus, so that by April, the British and German soldiers are beginning to sicken. The next month, French soldiers will sicken. Soon the British people themselves will be getting sick. And by July, the European continent is really awash in the illness. And now the world begins to take note because, in fact, people all over the world are getting sick with influenza in the midst of the summer, which of course is slightly unusual. But even then, it was seen as just another year of particularly bad flu. And then, bam, in late August 1918, the second wave explodes. We have a genetic shift of the virus, and suddenly this new, unique virus assaults the continent of Europe, the continent of Africa, the continent of North America, literally within a couple of days. And then the pandemic is off and running.
The flu is often named Spanish flu, but we know it should be called Haskell County or Kansas flu. But it originated in Kansas, at least that's what we know. It could have originated somewhere else. But there is a difference between a flu that's a flu and a seasonal flu, and there's a one that becomes a pandemic. Why this flu was so virulent, and also it came in 3 and probably 4 waves. So there were 4 waves, one after the other. Can you give us a little bit of understanding that what is the chemistry of virus, or so to speak, how the virus becomes so unstable and they multiply and then they become so devastating? And in this particular case, there was a back and forth between Europe and US, where it started here, went to Europe, and then it came back far deadlier.
So the wartime context creates the perfect environment for the evolution of a virus. So you have it passing first among American soldiers, then some American population, but largely then it's moving through the troops at the Western Front. Now, flu viruses are constantly doing a genetic drift, which is to say the virus is frequently going through transformations during the reproductive process. And that virus, which is most successful, so to speak, will survive. What happens, and again, I am no chemist, I am no scientist, so I will keep this relatively simple. What happens is sometimes you have something called a genetic shift. It's a dramatic remaking. You'll have a transformation when a single cell will host 2 separate distinct strains of influenza. But during the reproduction process, it recombines, and the 2 parental strains create a new hybrid virus, which means that there will be no pre-existing immunity to that. And this is what happens then with that second wave of influenza. Again, the movement of troops, the movement of war goods is helping them to spread it as well. So part of the reason it moves so quickly is its own ability at contagion, but also the war is facilitating its movement because of the movements of humans around the globe. And while the war is being fought in Europe, as we know, many of the European countries are using imperial troops drawn from countries all over the world. So again, the movement of the virus is facilitated very much by what's taking place worldwide with a war.
What was the public reaction, public health officials' reaction, and then also the public reaction when it first emerged in 1990, in the spring of 1919? And there are a lot of similarities between what happened then and what's happening now with the coronavirus as well. Give us a little sense of what were the early reactions of the public health officials, also the coverage in the editorial pages of the newspapers, and how different groups of people reacted, as you bring it up that in the book very well, that the experience of the virus differs dramatically based on your social standing as well.
So in the spring of 1918, there's very little notice of it in the United States. So there's really no public reaction. The nation is at war. No one wants to be distracted. Now, when it begins again in the fall of 1918, now the United States had been relatively free of illness during those summer months when the rest of the world is contending with it a bit. The United States is free of disease. So it arrives again for the United States then in late August. And people are very concerned about what's happening in Boston, but that doesn't mean they're doing anything about it. So there's relatively little awareness or acceptance of the reality that this is coming to everyone. So again and again and again, you see stories in local newspapers covering what happens in Boston, and then later what's happening on the whole East Coast. You'll see coverage where local leaders are saying, but fortunately, we here in Tacoma, Washington, are a healthy stock and we should be able to avoid this thing. Or because we have such a good government here in this particular community, we need not fear. There's a really powerful impulse among both political leaders and public health leaders to keep the public calm. And this has terrible consequences, in fact, because again and again, they simply refuse to acknowledge when the evidence becomes quite clear that this is going to be a global pandemic, that it is going to infect the entire United States, and that no community will be able to escape it. That evidence is there. But again and again and again, leadership, again, both in public health and in the political realm, have a tendency to downplay it. Clearly, they're afraid that the public will panic. Well, the reality, of course, is the public wants good information. The public acts very well when they know what's coming, when they're told the truth. And we see that in sort of the different sort of outcomes that some communities have. One of the things that really needs to be noted here as well is that the national leadership, and in this case, I'm really referring to the President of the United States, is absolutely lacking. Because the nation is at war, President Woodrow Wilson simply refuses to talk about the pandemic. He does not make a public address about the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919, ever. He is afraid that the nation will be distracted from the war effort. He makes every effort to simply ignore the pandemic. The costs of that, of course, are extraordinary because you need national leadership as people are trying to decide to what extent they're going to cooperate, say, with public health restrictions. So his unwillingness to speak to what was a national catastrophe that killed 675,000 Americans is to me simply mind-boggling and a terrible abrogation or a terrible failing, I should say, of national leadership. Gradually at the local levels, I think leadership does step up as they realize what happens, and you can watch sort of the same pattern being enacted in communities across the country as first infection rates and then death rates begin to skyrocket. And then you see people stepping up and paying attention, and you see public health people being able to enact the kinds of restrictions they had been hoping for, sometimes for weeks ahead.
There were a lot of cases, and obviously Philadelphia at that time paid a very heavy price simply because of the rapid urbanization and also very squalid and poor conditions. Especially the poor people paid a heavy price. Give us a little sense of how Philadelphia dealt with, which becomes a typical example of many other cities across the nation.
Yeah, Philadelphia, like so many cities, is convinced that they can avoid the kinds of consequences that Boston had already faced. So though they already have some cases in Philadelphia, a few days after those first cases, they go ahead with what was known as the Fourth Liberty Loan Parade. In order to raise money for the First World War, cities were asked to raise money. The war was paid for largely by loans that the public made to the government through these Liberty loans. And the fourth Liberty loan was to kick off in late October. And so in Philadelphia, as in so many cities around the country, despite the reality that this pandemic had arrived in their community, they hold the Fourth Liberty Loan Parade. And of course, within a few days, their figures explode. The city is completely unprepared to handle the scale of illness and death that they then face. There are terrible descriptions of morgues that are simply overflowing with bodies. Philadelphia is one of the places where they won't actually be able to keep up with the scale of the dead and will be forced to use some mass graves that will be dug by some young seminarians, in fact. Who will be in those graves? Not surprisingly, it's often people from the poorest neighborhood out in the outskirts of town. Recently arrived immigrant communities are the ones who will land in those graves. Philadelphia, like many communities too, is facing a shortage of medical care and nursing care. The war had taken something like a quarter of Philadelphia's doctors and even a higher percentage of their nurses. So they're lacking in the sort of, at least the caregiving that nurses can provide. And so Philadelphia is one of those examples where people really faced the very worst. They could not access any kind of reassurance from the medical community. They were very slow to provide sort of emergency care. The reality is, of course, physicians actually couldn't do anything except keep people comfortable during this flu pandemic. And yet, having access to information from somebody who was professional again, was something people were desiring and was simply not available. So they go through really the most horrific kind of experiences. And when you think about what's happening to individual families, there's a very famous story of a family whose child had died, and they would bring carts through neighborhoods in the morning. This is like resonates with images from the Black Death, of carts moving through the street of Philadelphia and people having to bring out the dead that had died during the night. And one family asking if please, could they just have enough time to grab a macaroni box to put their young boy in before he was taken away by this cart. These kind of ghoulish stories are worth telling because they suggest how important it is that we step up, and we step up early, to try to avoid the kind of overwhelming circumstances that Philadelphia faced in 1918 because of their unwillingness to prepare. I realize they were one of the early cities, so it always seems a little unfair to pick on Philadelphia. But they did have a relatively corrupt urban government at the time, which certainly didn't help them. And they also simply didn't heed that early lesson that was available to them, and that I think, again, we may have failed to heed, though I'm hoping that many communities that are not yet fully immersed in the 2020, or in COVID-19, I should say, the 2020 pandemic, I hope that they will take some heed from the experience of what happened to Philadelphia in 1918.
You have a very nice sentence in the chapter 2 where you mentioned that the virus did not discriminate among its victim, but the American culture certainly did. How did Americans try to make sense of the pandemic, and how the social identity had brought different experiences to different people based on the gender, based on the profession, based on the race, and based on, of course, the economic strength?
I'll start with the latter part of that question, which is the sort of inequitable landing of the flu. It's true that the virus simply did not discriminate except by age, really. One thing to note is that in this pandemic, the virus is especially effective against young, healthy adults. So about half of the American victims are people between the age of 20 and 40. That's a stunning statistic that really was quite shocking for communities. So in one way, the virus did discriminate, and it discriminated against a surprising population. But the way it lands, when we start thinking about sort of social and cultural dynamics and who suffers in particular ways, though the death rates may not have been affected particularly clearly by one's socioeconomic status, one's experience of going through the pandemic was very much affected by one's social status. Today, for instance, as we think about the practices that give you the best chance of avoiding contagion, we talk about social distancing. Who is best able to do some social distancing inside their household? Who is going to work in a context within which they're really exposed to a lot of other people? And really, most significantly, when we think about 1918, who has the resources to survive if one person is sick for a couple of weeks? So in 1918, when we think about socioeconomic class, if you were a working family, or especially a poor family of color, who would be at the very lowest ranks in terms of income and opportunity, losing one breadwinner for a couple of weeks meant families were going without coal to stay warm in the midst of a winter. They might be going without food because they ran out of money to actually purchase food. Excuse me. It might even lead to homelessness for some people. So to be poor meant an absence of opportunity to gain access to the most basic needs of human survival. Add into that we're dealing with a world in which healthcare is completely segregated in most communities. And as we're sort of building emergency hospitals, let's say, places for the sick to go to have some kind of care to remove the sick from their families, to perhaps prevent contagion, there's still segregation. So in communities in Richmond, Virginia, for instance, they open an emergency hospital, but for Black citizens, they're asked to go to the basement to find an emergency bed. In the North, in Philadelphia, that we mentioned before, they open emergency hospitals for the white community. They don't open a single emergency hospital for the Black community, which is a sizable community in Philadelphia. And it's left actually to Black physicians in that city to fundraise and to find the spaces for, and to, find the personnel to house those people of color in Philadelphia who sicken with the flu. So socioeconomic status and racial status meant that you didn't have access to both the basic essentials of taking care of oneself when family members are ill, and of actually having access to any kind of nursing or medical care during the pandemic. Gender plays in a very strange way, which is that I think in the midst of things being so different, so much chaos, people really grab hold of what is familiar. So these sort of status quo roles that people have are really embraced, or at least embraced by those with socioeconomic power. When it comes to gender, you see social expectations being put on men and women that are quite different. Women are understood to be natural caregivers, so they're expected to step up to be emergency nurses because it's assumed they have the kind of loving care and sort of natural capacities that would make them good at nursing. Men, on the other hand, are expected not to get sick. So they tend to carry a great deal of guilt when they're incapacitated by illness. It's a nation at war. I read letters of people where they were clearly feeling really not only sick, but guilty about being sick. Because as men, they weren't supposed to be getting sick. They were supposed to be contributing to the war effort. So socioeconomic status, race and ethnic background, and gender actually meant that different people's experience of the pandemic were really varied. And those with power kind of wanted to keep it that way, so to speak. There were those that resisted it, to be clear. There were people who called for more equitable care, who fought, for instance, to create their own emergency hospitals. There's a wonderful sermon by an African-American man in Washington, D.C., the Reverend Francis Grimke, who gives a beautiful sermon in which he suggests that the virus is actually God's way of showing how stupid white supremacy is. Because look, everybody's getting sick. God is trying to show you something, and will you learn this lesson from this pandemic? So there are those that are trying to overturn these social and cultural hierarchies and who are asking for a more equitable experience and hoping that perhaps the pandemic can open up that opportunity for Americans to see themselves as kind of equals, equals among the government, or equals among their God, or equals within their communities. But by and large, the status quo just stays in place, and stays in place hard. So though a few people will think about this as an opportunity for democracy, most people will read this and make sense of it through the lens of the war, and will think of what's happening as one more piece of fighting the war.
And in many ways, the virus was so virulent, it brought out the men in men and women in women. The doctors were very disappointed when they could not save the lives, and the nurses were very in their element because they were able to provide the care, and they were very comfortable when they saw that they were able to do that. But the brunt of the fatalities were also felt for right or wrong reasons, largely by the army, for some of the bad decisions that were made at that time, and because of the proximity of some of the camps near the origin of the virus, and then some of the decisions that made. Army, I think, as you brought up in the book, I'd rather let you say, almost 57,000 people, more than the people who died in the World War I, which was about 50,000.
No, it's really quite tragic that as the war is being prosecuted, the largest numbers of American deaths will be from this pandemic. What's interesting is the ways in which that never entered the sort of public conversation. People never really registered that this was killing far more Americans than World War I was killing. And it's stunning, of course, that when you look back, very few Americans until right now, I think, were aware that this pandemic had killed 675,000 Americans, but we're well aware that the United States had participated in the war and that 50,000 American soldiers had died there. You're absolutely right that the military decisions were very costly for those American troops, and actually for the American public as well, because troops continued to move around the country, and that really helps to facilitate domestically this virus, and then, of course, around the world as well. The war and the decision to continue to prosecute the war has terrible consequences, certainly for American soldiers, but for the American civilians as well, because those troop movements, again, help to facilitate the spread of the virus. And in many, many communities, you'll see that the first illness in that local area occurs at a local naval base, a local army base, and then hits the civilians a few weeks later, because there's a great deal of interaction between those local training camps and the local communities who are seeing them very much as a cash cow, so to speak, during the war.
Yet you bring out a very insightful point in the book, and that is influenza remade individual life, but not communal life. And that is a very sad thing to look back even after 100 years, that a lot of people suffered a lot, but those suffering was always private, was never talked about in public, and the communal life for many decades did not change at all. Why do you think that was the case?
And that is, for me, one of the great tragedies of this event is the ways in which, in the aftermath, the story just sort of disappeared. And I think two things probably happened. One, as we were just discussing, the ways in which it didn't remake the culture, it didn't change how people perceived one another. It didn't cause any dramatic shift in the national health structure or the ways men and women were perceived or the decision to, undo segregation. None of those things happened. So there were no sort of markers that made us think, oh, that was caused by the influenza pandemic. I think the other thing that happened, I think this is probably the easier one to talk about, is World War I. In 1918, the United States is in the midst of a pandemic. We're also winning World War I. And for Americans, this is a moment of arrival on the international stage. It is a story that fits with who Americans see themselves as being. Americans love to view themselves as the exceptional people. World War I fit that story so well. Europe mired in war for years and years, and then the Yanks come and we just win that war and it's over. And that's a glorious story that Americans loved to tell. A much better story, let's say, than that of a pandemic that arrives worldwide, in which the United States suffers more than 500,000 excess deaths. That's not a story Americans in 1918, 1919, 1920 really want to tell.
The story of the weakness of the vulnerabilities.
The American people do not like to see themselves as weak and vulnerable, or frankly, as just like everybody else. And yet we were. But as a result, during the war, as I said before, Woodrow Wilson didn't talk about the pandemic. It was always subsumed under the war. And in a sense, I think its memory is lost in that same way. It's very much seen as part of the war in the way it's talked about throughout the pandemic. Acting in regard to the public health restrictions is seen as being patriotic because it contributes to the war effort, rather than thinking about what it does to halt the pandemic itself. And so in the aftermath, the war continues to be the primary story. The pandemic is one little piece of that story, not a piece of the story very many people want to remember as a sort of marker in the American past.
And yet President Woodrow Wilson, who has been thought that many think that he suffered the influenza, and he also almost had dramatically altered attitudes and behavior after the attack of influenza, and that could have also sown the seeds of the Second World War in the negotiations.
I'm always tentative in talking about Woodrow Wilson. I don't know that we know for certain whether or not he suffered influenza. What we do know is that members of his team were sickened, and that may have affected the negotiations in Paris. Certainly we know that when he suffered his stroke, that after that he really was incapacitated. But again, it matters not in some ways whether that particular pandemic is the reason that things played out the way that they did. But what it does suggest is that even in the midst of these extraordinary decisions that were going to shape the world for decades to come, there were people suffering from influenza, but the world just kept on about its business. And we can see the sort of consequences for that, whether Wilson himself was sickened, again, which I'm just not certain of. He may have been, he may not have been. People of his team were, and the world was awash with, still recovering from not only a war and influenza. So again, this idea that we need to really take stock of what this is meaning to us now and what it will mean, I think is the message we can take from that.
And still, even after almost 100 years, we still don't know its global proportion, that how many people died in Europe, how many people died in around the world. And still we are learning and discovering that the scope of this, originally it was thought it was just about 30, 40 or 50 million, but now we think it could be even well close to 80 or 100 million or maybe more.
Yeah. And again, we don't know for certain because even in the United States, when the pandemic began, influenza wasn't a reportable disease. So unless someone died of it, so that you would then on the death certificate note what the illness had been, there was no way to know just how many people had been sickened. For years and years, the estimate was 20 million. And again, that had to do with the reality, both a sort of Eurocentric or Western-centric historical profession in the West, and the absence of robust public health systems in many parts of the world. So it's taken really sophisticated, insightful work by a lot of scholars to begin to build those models, to make sense of what took place all over the world. And that's why we now talk about 50 to 100 million. And of course, it's remarkable to say something like that it could be 50 or 100 million. The reality is that work is ongoing to try to figure out just how many people died worldwide. Thankfully, there are people doing that work, and so the estimates become a bit clear so that we certainly know that something like 20 million is an entirely inadequate figure. And again, the estimates suggest that it's possible that a third of the citizens of the world were infected at some point. So this was really quite global, quite contagious and widespread. How many people worldwide died of it is an ongoing, I won't say mystery, but an ongoing project, an ongoing puzzle that is being solved.
And that leads us to a very important issue of the book, and also it's reflected in the title, Lost Wars of Pandemic, as you mentioned in the subtitle there. Alfred Crosby. He said the Americans simply forgot the medical disaster of 1918. Tell us what it was all about and why it happened and why there is a public amnesia.
Again, I think it really has to do in part with the reality that it was taking place at the same time as the war. It was just difficult for it to get hold of the public's attention. It was such a private experience, right? People were dying individually at home. Whereas the war was this international and very public experience. Every day in the newspapers, we were getting reports of what was happening on the Western Front or earlier on both fronts in the war. So the war had this sort of international focus. Logically enough, people were dying by the millions in this war. When the pandemic comes along, the suffering is very much a private suffering. And even in the aftermath, I think another thing that happens is that there's very little writing done about the pandemic. And so it's the amnesia around it is not only, I think, at least in the United States, very much an impulse that fits with sort of the way this country thinks about itself. But I think also that the private trauma is something that isn't really accounted for publicly in any way. People didn't tell their stories in public ways. It was a different culture at the time. We didn't have social media. You didn't tell everybody everything about yourself every day on Facebook. It was a much more private culture, I think, at the time. But I also think that's really quite tragic because people did remember what happened to them. People continued to suffer. People who had lost loved ones, people who had suffered through the illness, who perhaps never fully recovered, lived with the pandemic the rest of their lives. And for me, that's one of the great tragedies, is that that suffering went unrecognized by those around them.
And I think our failure to recognize it and our failure to contend with it and also deal with it has had some significant consequences for this nation and all of us. The flu, as we believe, has been domesticated with us. Still, it keeps coming back again and again. You know, SARS, Ebola, and swine flu, and avian flu, and now we obviously have coronavirus, COVID-19. The issue is, have we learned anything? I mean, 10 decades have passed and yet nothing is publicized, nothing is talked about, and there are reactions that we have today are very similar to the reactions we had almost a century ago, and that seems like the amnesia has really cost us a lot.
I think that's very true. Are there lessons to be learned? Absolutely. Have we learned them? Perhaps not. The most obvious lesson that it offered us was that social distancing works. Right? At the time, they couldn't know in 1918, when they were practicing the closure of public spaces and the requirement in some communities of quarantining the sick, they couldn't know that that works. Today, we've had the opportunity to look at statistics from their time. The evidence is very clear, and we're beginning to see the evidence right now in our own time, right? Live action, we're seeing that social distancing is effective. Unfortunately, we also know that social distancing works best in those communities that impose it early, for the duration, and very strictly. And yet, even now, we have governors in the United States who have yet to put in place the shelter-in-place orders. It's stunning to me, the foolishness that they could continue to act in this way. If they would have known some history, if they would have studied 1918, or as you suggest, SARS or Ebola, they would have understood the ways in which distancing practices could be saving lives. Moving quickly really matters. So no, we didn't seem to learn that lesson. A second lesson that's very clear is that being prepared matters in order to do the kinds of things that we're able to do today. For instance, provide medical care. We know that the use of personal protective equipment is very important for physicians to lessen the spread of illness. We also know certainly that for those who become critically ill, ventilators are lifesavers. We don't have sufficient respirators. That's criminal lack of preparedness in my mind. So here we sit a century later with the opportunity to see that being prepared for an emergency can help you do the things you need to do to provide adequate care. And in these days, in 2020, care that can save lives. And we were unprepared. We have spent so much time, especially since 9/11, I'm afraid, worrying about national defense. We have moved money from FEMA. We have moved money from many things. And we have failed to maintain the kind of emergency preparedness that we're going to need, particularly in the context of global warming, where we're seeing another kind of international catastrophe taking place, whether it's wildfires or flooding or typhoons and hurricanes. We have continued to, in the United States at least, de-emphasize preparedness for those kinds of disasters as well. So there was a lesson. Emergency preparedness matters. And we have failed to act on that one as well, I fear. The third lesson that we have neglected, of course, is recognizing that these things land inequitably, right? That those who have fewer resources, those who are most vulnerable because of our sort of institutionalized inequities, that we need to be ready to step up to provide whatever is necessary to make sure that where one stands economically doesn't affect where one stands in terms of getting adequate care. That was very clear in 1918. It's been clear again and again and again, and we've continued not to be ready. We have not changed our systems to ensure that these things land in a more equitable and just way, that we could all say, we're in this together. I keep hearing that, and in a sense, that's true. What's awful about it is that we don't seem to have the same regard for each of us that we ought to have. And the last thing I'll say is I think another lesson is how important it is that we get good information. In 1918, it was clear that when communities were given really honest information from their leadership, they were more willing to go along with the kind of social distancing or other public health measures that they were asked to take on. Milwaukee's a wonderful example. They had a robust public health system. When their leadership told them what they needed to do, they did it. They did it as long as they were told. Restrictions were lifted. And then the third wave came. They put the restrictions back in place. And again, people were willing actually to follow those restrictions. And Milwaukee had a much lower death rate than a lot of other communities. Unfortunately, we still see some leadership afraid to tell us the truth, downplaying what needs to happen. And again, there are many people that I think can be faulted, but some of the governors of the country, as well as the President of the United States, I think have repeatedly downplayed or offered inexact or, in fact, incorrect information. That's not what people need. It's very clear from the lessons of the past that to provide good, clear information and to tell the truth is what people want and what will best facilitate the cooperation of people with the kinds of restrictions that will save lives.
The continual investment in being preparedness is such a key because influenza, when they strike very deadly and they come pretty fast. And if you're not ready, it can easily overwhelm your medical care in medical practitioners' abilities to provide the care. And
That's such an important point. Such an important point. Thank you.
you just cannot overlook that. It's something that we have to learn from what has happened over the last 1 century, and yet we keep to ignore it, keep hoping and wishing it will just go away and it will be just another seasonal flu and not a pandemic. The other issue that you also have in the book, which was also mentioned very well, that there is, in fact, in just a few decades ago, this was also removed from the textbooks as well, about the mention of the pandemic.
I know it was just never there.
It was never there.
It was just never there. It's only in recent years that it's begun to appear in some American history textbooks. I can't speak internationally because I haven't done that work, but certainly in the United States, it was just literally unrecorded. It's why Alfred Crosby, who wrote the wonderful, first powerful, deeply researched American text on the pandemic, when it was reprinted or released in a second edition, renamed his book America's Forgotten Pandemic. It just had disappeared from the public consciousness, even as it lived on in family lore and in stories that people tell one another. As an example, I received a letter literally yesterday from a woman who was born in October 1917, telling me the story of her family's experience with the flu in Minnesota in 1918. She remembers this story 100 years later, and yet it was not in American history textbooks. And her story was one, again, of 675,000 Americans' families, right? And yet it disappeared in our public storytelling.
You have a fascinating mention about the how few people in San Francisco took upon themselves to make sure that we don't forget about the HIV/AIDS virus through the quilt, and how it became so big. Explain to us.
Well, I was interested that historians kept saying, well, we never remember illnesses. This just isn't something that we do as human beings. It's a kind of memory that we simply can't tolerate. And I kept thinking, but wait, what about the AIDS quilt? And in fact, what happens there, right, is you have people who are of an activist mindset that are determined that what happened to their community, remembering, of course, that in the early years of the AIDS pandemic, it was striking especially in certain communities. And those gay men in San Francisco were one of the really hard-hit populations in the early moments. Now, of course, it's a worldwide pandemic that affects people around the world. Of whatever background, whatever, it matters not who you are in the world today as we think, well, it does matter actually greatly who you are and whether you are likely to suffer from HIV/AIDS. But in its early days, certain populations were hit with it. And the gay rights movement really took it on themselves to make certain that the kind of disregard that they had suffered in the early moments of this pandemic would never be forgotten. And the AIDS quilt, which was produced as a project, it's called the Names Project, in fact, required Americans to recognize that this terrible thing had happened and that in its early days it had been ignored because those that it was striking were suffering from disregard and discrimination against them. President Reagan simply refused to acknowledge that the AIDS pandemic was taking place for a couple of years. That's simply criminal. And that crime was not to be forgotten. And so I have great appreciation for the community that ensured that we didn't forget the early days of HIV/AIDS. What I worry about is that now we think of AIDS in the United States as having been essentially cured because in the United States, access to medicine can make HIV/AIDS something that one lives with rather than one dies from. Of course, that's not the case worldwide. This is an ongoing pandemic right now, especially in parts of Africa, for instance. And yet the world is not talking or thinking about it. So even as the coronavirus has gained our attention, and it is in fact warranting our attention, HIV/AIDS has been, in a sense, put aside by Americans, remembered, but seen as something of the past. And for me, that's something that I think we continue to need to reckon with.
We have been speaking with Dr. Nancy Bristow, the author of American pandemic, the lost wars of the 1918 influenza epidemic. So much about the book. Tell us a little bit about you, what you do now, and what profession you're in, and are you going to be writing another book?
Thank you for asking. So I am a professor of history and of African American studies at the University of Puget Sound in Tacoma, Washington. I've worked there for about 30 years. It's been what I call a great gig. My students are remarkable, and I learn from them every day. So I feel like one of the luckiest people in the world. I'm also able there to serve on the leadership team of the Race and Pedagogy Institute, a project designed to fight the ongoing presence of white supremacy and racism in our educational systems. And again, I name that group because from them too, I have been learning every day. And I am continuing to write. In fact, this very week, a book of mine is to be released. The official publication date is in May, but I have a new book coming out in just a few days called Steeped in the Blood of Racism. It is an account of another catastrophic moment and what I see as part of an ongoing epidemic in the United States, and that is state violence against people of color. So that book treats us shooting at a historically black college, Jackson State College, on May 15th, 1970, and explores again why it is that event is forgotten while Americans remember the event 10 days earlier, 11 days earlier at Kent State University, where also college students were injured and some killed at the hands of armed representatives of their government.
Thank you for your time, and also thank you for writing such a fascinating book. And we'll be probably talking to you again for the next book that is coming out very soon as well.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.